Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kuang, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. Today's guest is Hanna Thomas Uose, a writer, activist, and co-founder and principal consultant at Align, a consulting firm dedicated to supporting organizations in the progressive movement. Her debut novel, Who Wants to Live Forever, will be published in early 2025. In this conversation, we dive inside Hanna's somewhat unexpected turn as a speculative fiction writer, her interdisciplinary work with organizations, and the connection between time and world building in her vision for a better future for all. In addition to today's conversation, I will be co-facilitating an 8-week online writers workshop starting in January 2024 called Embracing the Multidisciplinary Writer, Lessons Across Genre and Form. We will be exploring a variety of writing disciplines and holding the space for writers to connect the dots beyond specialization. To learn more, click on the link in the show notes or visit my events page at www.robertquanhome.com. Hi, Hanna. It's been a while since we've caught up. I want to say congratulations and also happy belated birthday. You recently had a birthday and something to celebrate kind of all around the same time. How has that been?
Thank you. Yeah, it's really nice to catch up with you again after a long time. Yes, I turned 40 years old a week ago, and a couple of months ago I sold my debut novel, which is very exciting and which we've talked about before. And so that will be published in spring 2025, and it's very gratifying.
Yeah, and it's titled Who Wants to Live Forever. And,
yes,
knowing that you've said in the press release that it took you about 5 years, so I really want to ask, can you describe your experience of arriving here and what it's been like for you for the past 5 years with this project?
So I had the idea for the book around the end of 2017, I believe. And it was quite a strange thing to arrive in my head because I wasn't writing fiction at the time. I wrote quite a lot for my professional work. I've been working as a campaigner and in various nonprofits for a number of years. And so I've always had writing as part of that, but I wasn't writing fiction. But I had this idea and I became very preoccupied with it, but didn't at all know or think that I would be capable of articulating it, as a fully fleshed novel. But I started to experiment with it. I wrote a short story version, and I signed up to a few short writing courses and built up my confidence. And yeah, over time, it just sort of gathered momentum and speed. And I realized that, no, I do know, I do know what happens, and I knew what the world was. And I sort of followed my nose on that and tried to follow my intuition. And I eventually applied for a master's in creative writing, which I've just completed at the University of East Anglia here in the UK, which is in Norwich.
Another congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And all of that sort of coincided, in the middle of that was COVID. So I had a good year or two of a lot of time on my hands to dedicate to this. And it was just such a gift to have that as a focus during that period and to have the chance really to dedicate myself to it.
So prior to Who Wants to Live Forever, how was writing showing up for you? Because you said, it was sort of unusual that you were working on something that was fiction genre. So what was your relationship to writing prior to that?
I worked for about 5 years for a nonprofit digital campaigning organization. So I was one of the people arriving in a lot of people's email inboxes asking them to sign various petitions. So I'd be writing those kinds of emails every day and a lot of campaign content. So that was a lot of generating. And I suppose in that way you learn how to construct a narrative, albeit very short. And I also had a blog about 10 years ago. And I'd dabbled. I'd written various essays for places. I'd written some poetry, but I had never really. It had never really occurred to me to write fiction, and I still don't really know why. It
Hmm.
really was the idea that propelled me to explore it more. I didn't really have any ambitions to become a novelist or a fiction writer, so it's a really fun plot twist in my life that this has happened.
That is indeed a metaphor then. And, some of
Yeah.
the questions that you some of the questions that you explore, based on what's been shared is asking and provoking the audience to think about what makes a good life. How much time do we
Hmm.
need to reach our potential? What does it mean to be fully human? So, overall, what makes you so curious about these questions?
I think I've always been very, even from a very, very young age, I've always been very preoccupied with um, the sort of tragedy of the human condition and time passing and never having enough time to do everything that one might want. And I think I always have, I think one of my driving forces as a person is to like try and not try to not feel regret, which is clearly not possible, and clearly,
Mm,
I have a stack of regrets like anyone, but I really try to make decisions or live life in a way that will sort of not leave a stone unturned, if that makes sense. And not everyone
hmm.
needs to do that. Not everyone is like wired in that particular way, but I'm very curious as a person, and I think that can sometimes feel counterintuitive to the limited amount of time that we have as our kind of individual consciousnesses at any
Hmm.
particular time. And so growing
Yeah.
up, I also felt, I think, quite frustrated growing up. I felt, come on, let's get on with it. So I didn't really, I wasn't sort of big into school or having to go through all these hoops in order to live what I perceive to be a sort of free and independent life. Yeah,
Mm,
I don't know. I've just always wanted to cram in as much as possible. And also, then the sort of counter position to that is trying to cram in as much as possible is not necessarily a good life. It's not
hmm.
living with a sense of urgency or living in a way as to not ever feel settled or content or satisfied is also not the answer. And I think this book is a way for me to explore the different poles of that, and as well as trying to zoom out and thinking about the kind of bigger spiritual implications, I suppose, of these two ways of thinking, and to think, just because our life is limited, in any
Hmm.
particular
Hmm.
incarnation, that is a very Western way of looking at things, and I think just trying to have a more holistic, sort of talk myself into a more holistic way of thinking about time and life and the human condition. And I think it worked, honestly. I think sort of 5 years of meditating on that and what I thought about it and why, and sort of trying to tune into the different parts of me that were sort of more reconciled with it and not, was very interesting. And I do think that
Mm.
I think it was like a good exercise. Like, even if the book, nothing had happened with the book, I think that was a really worthwhile, inner personal journey for me to go on.
Yeah, what's coming up for me is that this is despite authors sharing our voice in that, and somewhat perhaps people see as selfless in some ways, but I also hear that Who Wants to Live Forever is your book. It's Hannah's book. And there's something distinctly powerful about that. And I want to acknowledge that. I'm also curious when you talk about spirituality, perhaps more philosophical, existential parts of your exploration. Does your British Japanese identity has it influenced your curiosity, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. The book is set in London, Tokyo, and San Francisco,
Mm,
and there's certainly a sort of thread of Buddhist and Shinto thinking and worldview that goes through the novel. And Shinto is the traditional
hmm.
religion of Japan. Yeah, so that definitely has influenced book, and the book is very much about these different cultural perceptions of these questions, of how we experience time and what the purpose of life is. I'm making the book sound so much more abstract than it is. It has a plot, it has characters, and a lot of stuff happens in it. But yeah, it's definitely got those different influences in it.
Well, I'm curious, obviously, in speaking to you about the author as well. And there's one observation I'll bring up because, I know you a little bit. And I remember sometimes you've been referred to as the human tuning fork, if I believe.
Oh, yeah.
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 So that's always struck me as a description. And I'm sure there's something there for me, but I'm also just really curious, where did that come from and how you relate to that, the human tuning fork?
Yeah, that's so true. I actually can't remember where that came from now. Maybe you remember more than me. I can't remember if I thought it of myself or if someone said it to me. But same. I mean, I think that, I had it for a while as my social media, just a one-line descriptor. I think there's something related to my professional work. So I've been working as a consultant for campaign and advocacy organizations for about 3.5, 4 years now. And a lot of the work that I do involves organizational design, coaching like yourself, but, geared towards something slightly different. And the consultancy which I run with a friend is called Align. And part of the thinking behind that was, how can we help people be in step with each other, work well together? And I think so much of that ability and skill is to do with just tapping into what's happening, below the surface, I suppose. Like what is being unsaid. I'll often go into an organization and the problem that you've been presented with, it's like you'll be brought in to solve one particular problem, but quite quickly from talking to everyone, it's clear that there's something else going on underneath, and that's it's sort of a process of uncovering.
Yeah.
And I do think that, the human tuning fork thing is like the ding, the kind of listening to that sense, I suppose, and following it. And I also think that that's a particularly creative instinct that artists are using in their work every day. They're having to follow their own inner sense of, right, what comes next? What is this? You have no one else to ask, apart from your own instinct. So I think that it's probably a very human trait that almost everyone possesses, but we're either dialed in or not at various moments. And I think it especially in a lot of the working environments that we have to exist in now, it's not particularly encouraged to operate in that way. But I think it can be incredibly efficient,
Why do you think that is? Why do you think sometimes organizations, teams, or a collective can operate from a place of almost trying to dial down our ability to sort of tune in and dial down our ability to sort of connect with each other and sort of in some ways be at the effects of each other, given that we're sharing the same space, and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, maybe this comes back to, what I was saying about these two different worldviews that I've been grappling with. I think so much of it is to do with a culture of urgency and a feeling of there not being enough time or money to achieve things. And so I think what ends up happening, on an individual level, maybe that looks like scheduling yourself and running yourself into the ground, trying to follow all of these different paths, but never quite letting one unfold. But on an organizational level, I think what it can look like is that 1,000 different people trying to implement 1,000 different solutions that they perceive to be the most efficient, and then either all running in different directions or all moving very quickly in a direction that isn't the right one. And then you have to spend a lot of time unpicking what you've done. The other thing is it's just very hard, isn't it, to, in the way that we're working now, both remotely, but also in a time crunched way, it's hard to build that relational foundation to be a tuning fork. You do need, I think, you need to know people well, to get a good read, and you need to know yourself well. And that's not particularly easy,
Yeah, in some ways I hear some of these questions that you explore as a writer or, in your upcoming novel are things that maybe can be observed inside of organizations as well, except we have to kind of find our way forward and our answers while also trying to achieve a goal or meet a common
Mm,
vision. But some of the existential questions that you pose, for some reason, I also hear inside of organizational work. And I'm curious,
mm.
are there skill transfers and overlap between your insights as a writer and through writing and also through like consulting work? Are there overlaps in this way?
Yeah, there definitely are. And maybe I'll just give like at this point, I'll just give a very brief description of the plot of the book. Um, so there's a couple at the heart of it, called Sam and Yuki, who are they're in London, and they're in a world very similar to ours, except that this new drug has entered the market called Ureta. And if you're wealthy enough, you can take it and extend your lifespan
Mm-hmm.
by up to 150 years. It's quite significant. And then they make different decisions about what they'll do, and we follow the course of their relationship over the next 20 years as they sort of face the consequences of that decision. And then we also meet Frank, who is the American inventor of the drug, and we meet two other characters. One is a character called Maya, who's a tech worker who goes to work for Frank in California. And then Paige is a more young and working class creative from London, and she gets sucked into this world. And so through all of those, it was very important to me to have an ensemble cast, and people with very different relationships to the drug and its effects,
Mm.
because I was very interested in exploring the moral grey area, which I think for very good reason. There's not a lot of space for that within the campaigns and advocacy sector.
Mm-hmm.
To have that time and space for expansive conversations that are held with a lot of nuance, because
Right.
they're so under pressure, to persuade and to raise as much money as possible and to
Yeah.
really make their case, which is the right thing, and to be very firm in their stance when there is a huge amount of opposition, and we're facing a rise in far right thinking and all of that, that it's forcing people to stand in their firmly held beliefs.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think over time, having worked in that space for around 15 years now, I think I just started to really develop a yearning to sit and kind of look at something from many different angles and not have to necessarily land in a particular place, or to stick with a particular position. And
Mm.
I think, when we're talking about the difficulties that organizations face, I do think that's one of them, that spaciousness isn't there, because the political reality and the material reality of working in that space at the moment is incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of looking at things from multiple perspectives, different angles, which is such a writerly practice in some ways that I find to be a great value. You've kind of spoken about your work in consulting and in activism as being inherently interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and perhaps even anti-disciplinary. And that's something that's always resonated with me.
Mm,
And it makes me curious, like what sort of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work is really exciting for you that really lights you up.
mm. Well, my hope over the next few years is that my writing work and my sort of social practice work can
Mm-hmm.
be a bit more in relationship with each other. As you
Mm.
say, they already are sort of in my head, but it would be
Right,
nice.
right.
It would be nice for that to kind of translate into my day to day. And I think what I'm finding interesting about writing, and I've started another project and I've got an idea for another one again, and they're all very much in the same vein. They're all kind of speculative
Yeah.
in some nature, and they're all sort of they're all kind of big thought experiments.
Yeah.
And I would love to bring that kind of that kind of approach to the nonprofit sector and the campaigns and advocacy sector. But yeah, just like I've been saying, I think there's not that much spaciousness to think about very long-term thinking. There's always a lot of crises, there's always a lot of panic, there's always something to respond to in the nonprofit sector, and there's not that much time or resource to plan and, you know, be on the front foot and setting the agenda and being propositional. And I think one of the only ways we can do that is encouraging people to sit down and project forwards and really give themselves not only space to sort of dream and imagine, but to therefore, you know, what's the plan? What's the sort of 50-year plan for social progress? And because of the way our electoral cycles work in both of our countries, you know, it doesn't feel politically sensible to do that all the time, but it's so necessary in order to like build a vision for where we're going. So I have a lot of ideas about that. And I think, you know, the private sector and the military, they're doing this. They've been doing this for the whole time, you know, war gaming, or, you know, the way our financial system works, and speculation. And these are the methods that govern the way that we live. And yet, in a strange way, the sort of progressive sector, I think, hasn't had the room for that much of this, or as much as might be useful. So I'd love to kind of start thinking about how can speculative storytelling and its methods be used to create strategies long term.
Yeah. In speaking to that, I want to read a quote that you have shared. It's by Walida Imarisha. I think you know which one that is. Anytime we try to envision a different world without poverty, prisons, capitalism, war, we are engaging in science fiction. When we can dream those realities together, that's when we can begin to build them right here and now. So I think that really resonates with what you're speaking to as well, where there can be a lot of short-term planning in trying to address very long, very historical, very lineaged issues and systems that are in place. So one of the things that you've talked about is the concept of looking at our internalized capitalism. I'm curious really quickly if you want to touch on like some of the tenets that can come out of having the internalized capitalism really running your life, and also truly what has helped you deconstruct this line of thinking.
Yeah, excellent. Gosh, I mean, I do think this is one of those that it's so knotty, and it's so, I just think on a deep level, like I'm an elderly millennial. And I think that this is going to be the defining, you know, in the way that we sort of talk disparagingly about boomers. I don't mean we as in you and I, but sort of the generational discussion that's kind of like, oh, boomers have had it so easy, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I do think the millennial critique that can be leveled is the kind of leaning in to capitalism in a way that clearly doesn't work. But, you know, it's totally understandable. I mean, like, you know, it's just like, what else can you do? We're all caught in this web. But I think it takes a lot to unpick. Like on an individual level, I find it very hard to, you know, not suffer from productivity guilt. You know, I sort of feel such a rush of endorphins when I consider myself to have had a productive day. And at the end of the year, you know, I'll sort of take stock and be like, what have I done? And I don't know that I'll include the novel in this really, you know, as well. Like the novel can become evidence of, oh, I wrote 1,000 words today, or oh, I only wrote 50 words today, or oh, I only, you know, sort of measuring by visible evidence rather than like, yes, the writing of the novel has been the last 5 years, but there's absolutely no way I could have written it had I not also lived the 10 years before that. Do you know what I mean? Which provided a lot of the content and the feeling and the sensibility of the novel. And in the living, I had no idea that was what it might be leading to. So all of which to say is like, I think it's just a habit of using the wrong metrics, which I think is also a common theme with some organizations and with individuals, is that, you know, we look for evidence of whether we're doing well or badly, and sometimes the evidence that we collect is just completely not what we should be paying attention to,
and sometimes completely arbitrary, meaning, you know, we
absolutely
ultimately assign the meaning to the difference between 1,500 and 1,000 words and whatnot, right? And we can do that
Absolutely.
to ourselves all day long, every day. Do you feel like the past few years has really influenced this topic and this concept? I know for me, I'll speak, having to look at how work can function within the past few years has had a big impact in what I would say is deconstructing my own internalized capitalism. Just seeing all of the cracks and the unsustainable elements of work and even socialization in some ways. And yeah, the past few years has had a big impact on me. And I'm wondering if that kind of relates to what you're talking about.
You mean through COVID and living through lockdowns and everything?
Yeah. And one of the things that I saw people finally prioritizing that can be such a sacrifice when you internalize this way of thinking is your health. So
Mm-hmm.
I saw a lot of people wrestling and reckoning with what's truly important for them and what are they
Mm.
willing to sacrifice, or what is it really going to cost them, quote unquote, in some ways. And even for
Mm.
me, just in thinking about work, it really made me have to confront these issues rather than kind of being more of a bystander. Like these are things that affect me, but not enough that I can still focus on my daydreams in some ways. But then suddenly you're just confronted with all these real decisions and commitments you want to make, and also trying to create the life you want. And I'm not sure if I'm making much sense, but you know,
Mm.
certainly for capitalism and in some neoliberal trappings, I guess the past few years has had a major impact on me for that.
Mm. Yeah. I think personally, I mean, in my individual experience of COVID, one, I worked like a maniac because
Yeah.
I already worked from home. I had just launched a business and I worked more than full time through 2020 because I thought, what else? What else do I have to do? So I sort of just filled
Yeah.
my time with work and with writing.
Mm.
And it was a ridiculously productive year, but of course it it was also just ridiculous, like
Yeah. Yeah.
um and I think it did have an accelerating effect on my decision making in the sense that I wouldn't have applied for the masters, which I did in 2020.
Hmm.
I don't think I would have applied for that at that particular moment. I think it would have eventually happened, but possibly not for a couple of years. And I did see that and observe that in family and friends, some big decisions being made. But of course, there are so many other people would just, who probably have absolutely no time to think about their own personal lives at all, like working in more frontline
Yeah.
roles
Yeah.
or, you know, caretaking. And so I think it had a strange accelerating and decelerating effect, and probably quite an uneven effect in different ways on everyone. But yeah, it is strange, isn't it, that we've all been through this shared experience and have come out of it with probably lopsided lives than what we might have had.
Yeah. I recently read an article that was there was a phrase that's caught on the pandemic pause or something to that effect. And I think
Mm.
that really speaks to me in that we sort of had to focus on certain areas, either by
Mm.
choice or just for survival. And then other aspects of our lives kind of took a pause. And I very much felt that myself as well.
Mm.
And you've shared in some of your workshops and things like that in really trying to connect with how it's impacted us the past few years. Like you've talked about, I'm sure other people have used this phrase, but you've mentioned like Zoom trauma, which I thought was
Mm-hmm.
so apt in trying to capture what is really affecting us all. And I love that you
Mm.
were able to just name it, especially like on the onset. So I really love some of
Yeah,
the resources that you have about language and organizing and how we can do better. So I just want to say that.
thank you.
So, what are some other things that you feel like we should, maybe not should, but that we can focus on in order to work towards a more just world? We've talked about some specific topics, but I'll throw it out to you.
Mm. Gosh, I mean, yeah, if
Right.
only we knew the answers. I mean, yeah, we're talking at a time where there's just catastrophe unfolding in Gaza.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've had some conversations with organizations in the last couple of days who are who are connected to that situation. And, you know, there's a huge humanitarian and short-term effort that is happening and will continue to happen. But the conversations I've been having are sort of about the long-term capacity building, the momentum. I just think I think the other thing that novel writing does is really slow time down. I can't remember
Yeah.
when I think we were talking during lockdown, weren't we? And
Yeah, it
I
was
think
right before you started the program, if I'm trying to place it
right,
in time,
yeah,
but I'm not sure what year
yeah,
that would
yeah.
make it.
And I think when I first, in the earlier stages of writing the novel, I felt extremely, I just couldn't believe how long it was taking me. I was
Oh,
so delusional.
interesting.
When I first started the novel, I thought, "Oh, I think I'll have a draft in like 3 months." And my sister looked at me like, "Are you insane?" You know, and the first draft took me 2 years. And then, you know, and I'm about to receive my edits from my editor, and I still have another, you know, 8 or 9 months ahead of edits.
Mhm.
And so in total, it would have taken absolutely ages. But the weird thing is that as time has gone on, time has sort of slowed down. Like, I feel like I could be writing it forever, you
Yeah.
know, and I think there's just something about, alongside the urgent and crucial and much needed response work in whatever area of social and environmental justice that one might work in. There's just such a need for the sort of 200-year horizon at this point, I think. You know, I think there's been some
Wow.
studies recently that there's even the word future has become less and less used in the media. Like, or if you talk to young people about the future, it's sort of this vague and empty. It's just different for younger generations now than it was. I think probably millennials were the last generation to have some optimistic version of the future. If you grew up in the 90s, I think there's a whole,
Yeah,
not
right.
everyone, of course, but, you know, I think for a
Right,
good chunk
right.
of people, they were looking,
Certainly in the
um,
West and some, yeah.
it certainly, yeah. And I just think for a much greater proportion of people now, that is not the case. And so what is it that we have to do? We have to collectively like pull together and be like, what can we make of this? You know, what does the other side of it feels like we're about to enter a tunnel, doesn't it? Like we're on a train or we're in a car or
Yeah.
something, and we are in this period of uncertainty and you know what's on the other side of it. I just the only people who are trying to do that, unfortunately, are a load of tech bros in Silicon Valley. It feels like, and they are really
Hmm.
setting the agenda for us for the next few centuries. And I just feel that part of the challenge will be to turn our attention towards that.
Yeah. I hear so much sort of, in some ways, collective driven or community driven energy to it, because this is sort of an idea that is working towards a vision that will outlive us and
Mm,
should do that if it is in fact sustainable.
mm.
And I find that really interesting, especially based on the themes that we're talking about today with you,
Right.
in
Yeah.
looking at time and what's possible, barring a
Yeah.
miracle drug perhaps later. But, I find it
Yeah.
fascinating that it's important to commit to action, commit to bearing witness, and not just be a bystander, but also
Yeah.
finding ways to treat time as if it's bigger than all of us in some ways. And anyway, there's a contrast there that's really
Yeah.
resonating with me.
Totally. And to not, I mean, you know, at the beginning of this conversation, I was talking about sort of limited span of our lives, but to really, that's such an individualistic way of thinking about life.
Hmm.
You know, I think a lot about cathedrals, and when I was young, I lived in Oxford, mainly when I was growing up, which has a lot of sort of historic buildings and things,
Hmm.
and old monastery buildings and things like that. And you'd walk in, and I just really couldn't believe. I'd be like, God, who would want to spend their entire life building something that they would not, which they knew they wouldn't see completed? You know, there are some cathedrals that have taken over 100 years to build or 200 years to build. And so,
Yeah.
generations of the same family would work on this one building. And I just couldn't understand it. I'd be like, I'd want to die. I'd hate that.
Right.
And now I just think so differently about that. I'm just like, it's a way of extending one's own life. And similarly, like, working in the political movement, I think I was very sort of energetic, and, I had all of the traits of, I'm 40 now, so this makes me sound ancient, but when I was in my early 20s, I was very outraged and self-righteous, and as I should be, as young people need to be to drive things forward. And then I sort of had a period in my late 20s and 30s where I just felt like this real realization, like, oh, I don't think I'm going to see the fruits of this. Like, I think whatever I'm fighting for now, that's for the next generation. It's not going to be in time for me to derive the whatever the benefit was that I saw. And again, it's just like, okay, that's maybe a sort of challenging thought that one has to move through. But then, I don't know, it's just kind of like, well, so what? Yeah, it's not for you. It's not for you. It's part of, and what I've benefited from is the work of people who went before me, like people of my grandmother's generation. It was the work that they did that I benefited from. And so it's that's part of it. And that's the nature of things.
Your life is bigger than your life.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
When we think about our elders and our ancestors, the lives that had to exist in order for us to be here. And I certainly did not necessarily sink into that until probably the pandemic myself, in thinking about some of these things that you've explored quite in depth already. But yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And it's been so enlightening. And I love talking about these things that are a little bit difficult to pin down, but sometimes you need the right conversationalist. So thank you for indulging me in these sometimes somewhat tricky topics.
Of course.
I do want to ask you one last question that's just maybe slightly out of the box. And I'm not sure why I thought of it, but can you describe a moment where you were unapologetically you?
Well, the thing that comes to mind is I'm in a choir. I'm in a choir called Lips, that is a trans-inclusive women's pop choir in London. And we have 80 women and non-binary people in the choir. And I mean, number one, it's a really amazing community of people.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I'm in charge of the dress code. And it's a really...
That's a twist. Okay.
It's a really sort of incredible creative exercise. And this year, the past 2 years, I've worked with the choir to kind of build like this Lips world. What we have, this very amazing bubble where we share so many values and we encourage each other to be ourselves, and there's a real support there. And so, every year, like, we go away on a weekend retreat, and I've run this workshop this year around like, okay, what does this Lips world look like? If the world could feel more like how this space feels to us, what would it look like? And therefore, if the world felt like that, what would we wear? How would we walk down the street? How would we? And we've sort of built this dress code up through that exercise. And so by the time we get on stage, the idea is, we're inviting the audience into this space with us, and really expanding that felt sense of that safety and freedom and community to the people watching, and it becomes this really shared, glorious experience. And in those moments, it really does feel that way. It's the mantra of the choir, if I'm allowed to say it, is "fuck you, you're welcome." And and there's just something of that energy that's just like, yeah, you're meeting the energy of the world with your own equal and opposite energy. And I think those are the times where I'm like, God, this is how it's meant to feel, Yeah. So those moments. So we have a gig on December 16th.
Yes. No, seriously, we'll plug this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. And thank you for bringing music into the space, because I know you're a musician too. And that was big. That was a big saving grace for me over the past few years as well. So thank you for sharing that, especially in creative expression, I suppose art making, if you will, in community. As a writer, I'm much too comfortable in solitude. So those spaces are especially important for me as well. So looking ahead at 2024, is there anything that you want to share or spotlight, whether it's for Align or even just for your own personal things? There doesn't have to be anything, but if there is, I would love to spotlight it.
Thank you. Yes, I'm about to publish a research paper with UN Global Pulse, which is the innovation lab for the Secretary General. And that is some research looking into how art, imagination, and creative practice can be in service of organisational transformation. And that is being launched on December 13th. And I've interviewed just such a host of incredible people for that research. And I'm very excited to put it into the world, and very excited that the UN is looking into things like this.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so I felt that was such a great project to work on this year. And then, I'll be busy working away on my edits until the summer, and then moving into promotional mode for that. And we'll continue to be working with different organisations and trying to move some of this work I've talked about ahead, and move some ideas forward over time.
Well, thank you for contributing to this world building that I think will help make it a better place. So thank you for your time and your insights today, Hanna. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the questions. They were really interesting.